For nearly 15 minutes it took me a while, but I eventually called out and asked if someone was there. But I didn't dare go over there to try and see. I would have heard something, or saw someone moving over there if there had been anyone I didn't finish. I patrolled the door and immediately returned to the desk downstairs where the lights were on in the lobby. My boss even asked me when I told him about it, and he just nodded like, yeah, that happens sometimes. I didn't hear anything else the entire time that I worked there. After that, I even checked the cameras that were in that area, and I can assure you that there was no one there. I always used to figure that ghosts were real, or I wanted to believe that they were, but that night completely proved home that ghosts really are real. And when one asks for help, you probably shouldn't really risk yourself. It's Un season in Japan, a week in which the spirits of the departed are believed to return to families and loved ones as such. I'm curious to hear if anyone has had any experiences and encounters with spirits here, either in Japan or Asia. Here are some of what myself, as well as family and some friends, have experienced over the years. So my husband is a hard atheist and refuses to believe in the paranormal. He does have one story. However, that made him a bit spooked. You see, he grew up in a mountainous area with little tunnels running through the area so cars can access the more remote places. In many areas, there's a newer, lit-up and cleanly paved tunnel running directly beside an older and less used tunnel from decades ago. According to him, one day he and his friends were playing down by a river, then chose to head back home through an older tunnel. He went in ahead on his bike and saw a woman and her little girl walk in the opposite direction towards the middle of the tunnel, and he passed by them without looking too closely. He turned to look back to see where his friends were, and the woman and the girl were nowhere to be found. The tunnel in question would take a solid few minutes to pass through on a bike, let alone on foot. I mean, I've personally walked through the tunnel, and though I didn't come across anything like this, the air gets very cold and heavy towards the middle, to be sure. I also have a coworker that works at an elementary school about 30 minutes in the mountains. It's an older school, about 100 years or so old, but it's warm and inviting, and I've always felt pleasant when I visit. There's a little nook with couches and the staff room, and it opens to a huge 2-story hall with a hallway leading down to the lunchroom and kitchen areas. My co-worker has recently been seeing a lot of activity in the hall. More than once he's walked out of the staff room and seen a man hunched over Audible in the hall, as if reading something. When he walks towards the man, he passes by a pillar, and suddenly, the man is gone. He's also seen movement in the nook in the staff room, and lunch ladies often report a presence of a little child in the kitchen, who asks them where the lunchroom is. This school has 6 teachers and 25 students, with everyone knowing everyone. The man and the child, though, are reportedly no one that anyone knows. Now, I'm not apt to seeing ghosts, but I like to jokingly say that I was sensitive due to a lot of strange goings on in my childhood home over the years. This came back to bite me, though, when I got a little bit overly cocky, I guess you could say, during some ghost stories in the town over, and I think something followed me home. So I used to live in Kushima, Japan as an English teacher. Back in 2018, my home was in a city nearby in a bright and warm 2-bedroom apartment that was 2 floors above another teacher's. My best friend lived nearby in a 2-towered apartment complex, and below another teacher, Todd. So I would visit the area to stay over and hang out every once in a while. Once my best friend returned to the US, a new teacher, Ashley, moved in. But since my friend's apartment was being renovated, Ashley stayed in the apartment next door for a few months. That October, I took my little black car down and went to a barbecue dinner where Ashley, Todd, and some other friends were telling ghost stories. Ashley was visibly upset when it came time for her story, which was apparently true and happening. Currently, she said she would hear walking around from Todd's apartment at late hours, and Todd had told her every time that he was out visiting his girlfriend at the time, so it clearly wasn't him. She also mentioned having horrible dreams about being stuck in her bed, while her room filled with water as a ghost, with long black hair, stood outside of her window as if demonstrating, "This is what I can do to you." Todd was backing up these claims, confirming the calls from Ashley, and that he indeed was never around when they came. His brother, who is like a kind of medicine man or shaman in their community, apparently reached out to him out of the blue, saying that he had a dream that compelled him to draw a picture of what he saw. Todd pulls out the text of the picture his brother drew, and Ashley and myself also began freaking out. At its sight, it was a picture of a white ghost with long black hair, crouched as if crawling on the outside balcony of an apartment. Ashley swears that it's exactly what has been appearing in her dreams, and all OFIS confirm unequivocally that the backdrop of this drawing is the exact building where Todd and Ashley live, the one where I'd visited my best friend dozens of times. Everyone is freaked out, but also sort of excited for some reason, like, oh boy, a real ghost situation. How fun for us, how naive we were. We came to realize we decided to go back to Todd's place once we finished eating, and I felt a heaviness when I walked in. I told him immediately and seemed intrigued, but brushed it off as it's his apartment, and he's got to be able to fall asleep there that night. I noticed that the same area that I felt heaviness was completely fine as I left to go home, but the entire solo drive back to my apartment was incredibly fear-filled and really tense, and I was afraid to look behind me as if I were going to see something in the back seat. I brushed it off as just my imagination, as I too had to be able to fall asleep that night, and proceeded to try and do so. When I got home now at 2:30 in the morning, I woke up drenched in a sweat with my arms and fists clenched so tightly around my head that I had lost feeling in them. There was a deep and dark heaviness all around me, and I just felt this overwhelming fear not to open my eyes. I'd never been one to have nightmates or sleep paralysis or anything, and I was completely awake as I remember being unable to fall back asleep and thinking like, oh no, I have work tomorrow. Why the heck am I not sleeping at a time like this the next morning? Though I texted Ashley what happened, and she freaked out saying that she didn't tell anyone this. But the exact same thing happened to her when she had the nightmares. She also asked me if I heard any wooden-like tapping coming from inside of my house, and I said yes. He noticed something coming from the corner when I got home, and I just chalked it up to the support beam settling. She gets even more worked up over this, saying that she didn't say anything about the corners, but that's where she heard the tapping as well. She and I messaged Todd immediately asking if there was something his brother could do in this case, since apparently he had a dream about this happening too. Basically, he sent us over some symbols on paper and told us to burn them in the apartment to purify the space and to leave one unburned to repel whatever it was it took. A few days during which I begged the teacher below me to let me stay with her, as my preciously warm and welcoming home felt suffocatingly heavy and dark in ways that I still struggle to explain, and it took about 3 days to arrive. And until then, the tapping continued in corners of my room in theme. In time, I discovered what appeared to be handprints on the inside of my car's rear window after that drive home, which normally wouldn't be possible as I drove a Datsun Move at the time, and it was far too small for anyone to fit in the back. A disconnected phone line also rang at 8:15 p. one day, which my then boyfriend was there to witness. Once the papers with written symbols arrived, we burned them as told, and the heavy atmosphere cleared up immediately. There's no interesting ending to this story other than that it hasn't bothered us since, but to this day I have one of those symbols laminated as protection, so it stays far, far away. I've also stopped going to places said to be hosting frightening spirits because I've wisened up with time and experience again, though like I said, At the beginning, I'm interested to hear of any other experiences had either here in Japan or around Asia. Well, when I reflect on my childhood, I have a reoccurring memory that always baffles me. I remember one day, I was about 5 or 6. I was at home alone with my mom, while she napped. I don't have an exact memory, but I recall sitting on the couch in our living room and looking up, and in front of me was a massive praying mantis-like creature. It was so massive that it filled the entire room. I'm talking like 8 ft tall. At least I don't really recall it moving much, if at all. But I went into freeze mode and felt like I shouldn't make any eye contact. I felt like I couldn't move and was paralyzed by fear. I sat there, trying to be as still as possible for a couple of minutes. I knew distinctly that this was not a dream too. My childhood brain could only process it as being an extremely large bug, but I felt incredibly confused by just how large it was. I remember kind of just thinking that it wasn't something particularly strange, and must have been something that I just hadn't learned the existence of. Yet, however, I knew that I was scared. Eventually, I mustered up the courage to run upstairs and ask my mom for help. I woke my mom up and told her that there was a massive praying mantis downstairs. She, of course, just thought that it must have been a normal-sized bug. She comes downstairs and obviously it was gone. I remember being too stunned by its disappearance and almost embarrassed to tell her what I had actually seen and how strange it was. I remember feeling very confused and trying to understand how my imagination could have possibly generated something that felt so real. Later in life, I had a friend. Her name was Eve, that did mushrooms with a bunch of friends. She had a difficult experience with how some of her friends responded to the substance. Eve was essentially supposed to be their guide, but Eve couldn't figure out how to assist the others, and it was as if the others had forgotten how to breathe. At one point, Eve said that she was suddenly greeted, though, by a praying mantis while were somehow giving her advice on how to help the situation. The advice resulted in Eve being able to resolve the problem too. So if anyone has any feedback or theories on this, then I would love to hear them. I've always been very confused by it all, and to be honest, I still don't know what to think of music. It's something really strange has been happening lately. And I know I'm not crazy, because friends of mine have experienced this with me on 2 separate occasions, but I swear that I'm teleporting across town. Somehow this has happened to me 3 times, and it's seriously starting to freak me. How did it happen for the 3rd time less than an hour ago? I was riding on my friend's car back to my place from a movie theater on the opposite side of town, a trip that would normally take around 15 minutes. It took us 5. And I noticed what had happened almost immediately. But I didn't want to say anything until my friend E did. Out of fear of sounding crazy on the drive, we randomly ended up downtown close to my place much sooner than we should have. The transition is so seamless that I can't tell the difference until I see man-made landmarks like buildings. He mentioned that he didn't make any turns that he'd normally have to get there. We just sort of ended up there. We weren't distracted by a conversation or anything, and the both of us were stone cold sober. Then he started to freak out a little bit. I told him about the other 2 experiences, that I'd had more on those later. But we made it to my place and decompressed for a bit before he left in the car. I told E about the other 2 events that I experienced the first time I had. Something like that happened. I was walking to a gas station to grab a snack after work. And somehow ended up walking on a street like a mile down the road. No time had passed at all, and I know this because I check my watch fairly often. The second experience was the more drastic of all 3 that I've had, though I was in the car with another friend of mine. His name is Jay, and we were on our way to a Walmart, a 30-minute drive away from his place one morning. But we ended up getting there in 10 minutes. He noticed what had happened shortly after starting the drive over, and We took a turn into this more scenic road on my state, Virginia, which would be a straight path to North Carolina. But instead of us going towards North Carolina, we ended up in a very similar road, much closer to that Walmart within a matter of seconds. The transition was nearly unnoticeable until, well, I saw buildings that I recognized from part of the town the Walmart is in. And that experience, it really freaked me out. I have no clue what's going on. And to be honest, I'm genuinely really scared. I don't know what's happening, and I want to find out, which is why I'm here. Has anyone else experienced something like this? Another thing too that happens, and this has been consistent with all 3 times, is that I, along with E and J, get this sort of horrible burning sensation in our lower chests, and we feel this awful sense of uneasiness. All of a sudden, standing up after an experience like this feels like a burden, and walking around is awkward and clumsy too. All 3 times I've had this happen, I, along with E and J as well, have been completely sober. So please help, because honestly, I just want to know what the heck is happening. Music. So I was maybe 9 or 10 years old in Mississippi, visiting my grandma with my sister. It was the middle of the night, and I'd been watching TV, wanting a drink. I got out of my grand's living room to go to the kitchen now. My grand had attic and a huge window that would show outside my grandma. She lived right by. The woods rarely saw anyone at night that weren't hunters looking for deer. Look out the big window. Feeling sort of scared all of a sudden, that's when I noticed outside there was a man in a black suit. But the weirdest thing was that he had no face. At least that's what it looked like. Seeing a man with no face is horrifying, especially right next to the woods, and you know that no one else is awake at the time. I went to the kitchen to get my drink, then looked out the bay window in my grandma's dining room, which was attached to the kitchen. The faceless man was closer to the window now, and he just sort of stood there unmoving but seemingly staring right at me. My chest was pounding with fear. After all, the man was closer than before. Going back to the living room, knowing that I'd be safe due to the locked doors, but also still kind of freaking out in the end. I just sort of sat there and watched some TV. I finished drinking my drink and stand up looking at the window in the living room, and the man was closer once again, still staring me down, his hands by his sides. Feeling even more panicked, ego to throw away the can of soda that I had to drink in the kitchen. I looked down to the bay window once more, and he hadn't moved closer this time. I walked back to the living room and turned the TV off, feeling eyes staring me down. My grandma was asleep. Her husband was asleep with his sleep apnea machine going on in the background in their room. I left the living room to go to my room shared with my sister, and I never looked back. I walk into my room to find my sister passed out, soft snores leaving her lips, and eventually I lay down on the ground and I fell asleep. I found the courage to share this after, well,